Newspoll of the year is out. Of course, the excitement about the polls was dampened somewhat in the wake of that May election, when there was a big mea culpa from a lot of polling companies about getting, in particular, the last few weeks wrong. But this one has been much anticipated after, of course, the bushfire crisis and some visible anger out there from the voters towards Scott Morrison. So was this just a few voters out there caught at some of their worst moments, or was this widespread? Well, it seems to be the latter. Let's take you through the results from this Newspoll. First of all, the primary vote. And look, for the party, it's not too bad. This is more about Scott Morrison. You can see the coalition down 2 points in the primary, Labor up 3, the Greens up 1, and One Nation down 1 there. So this is not a massive movement in terms of that primary vote. It does transfer on a two-party preferred basis. The coalition going from a strong position, they were up 52-48 now, 49 to 51 down. Hardly disastrous if this is one of the worst moments for the government. What will be a concern, though, for Scott Morrison is his personal ratings out of all of this. First of all, preferred Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, someone that people were talking about as not perhaps cutting through all that much. Well, look at the change over the summer. 39 to 43, Scott Morrison losing 9 points there to Anthony Albanese. That is a huge turnaround in terms of how this plays out, and as leaders' approval as well, the approval rating. Well, again, this is bad news for Scott Morrison. Anthony Albanese, yes, he has surged up 6, but Scott Morrison down a massive 8. So 45, he was hovering towards neutral territory there, all the way down to 37. I'm joined now by our political editor, Andrew Clennell, for more on this. Andrew, look, I don't think people will be all that surprised by this. Perhaps the extent of the personal popularity coming off Scott Morrison. Will this be alarm, or will this be, well, it's not coming off the party yet, it could have been worse?
Both, Tom, actually. I think there'll be a fair bit of alarm in terms of Scott Morrison and his people's reactions. And bear in mind, Scott Morrison, a former New South Wales Liberal Party director, he would know a lot about polling, and he would know what it would mean. And as you say, the two-party preferred, you look at that and you just sort of say, so what? Even the primary, you sort of say, so what? Although that's starting to put Labor in a winnable position, but who cares? It's 2.5 years out. But yeah, it could have been 53-47. But this disapproval figure is a disaster. You know, and the fact that we're in a position where the government's saying, oh, well, perhaps it's to be expected given the month, shows you how bad his month has been. I mean, I've spoken to the Newspoll this morning, and what they're saying to me is it's not just the 59% disapproval rate itself, it's the drop, or the increase. And there have been very few times where you've had an increase in that magnitude, I'm told. One of the times was after Julia Gillard reneged on her election promise and announced a carbon tax. So that's a comparison you don't want. Wow. People are also saying to me this morning, well, Paul Keating was 75% disapproval. And I asked when, and it was in late 1993. Well, look at the parallels. I mean, in 1993, Paul Keating won the unwinnable election, just as Scott Morrison is purported to have done. And within 6 months, he'd gone that far south. So there are dangers here for Morrison. None of us should get carried away. I mean, you know, Turnbull and Abbott only got rolled after 30 news polls against them, for goodness sake, not one. But it is extraordinary to me how this has become about Scott Morrison, this bushfire crisis. Now, let's run through this, Tom, if you don't mind. On December 10, in Sydney, he gives a press conference, not on the fires, which are going at this time, there's smoke everywhere, but on religious freedom, Scott Morrison. And in this press conference, he talks about the fact that Rural Fire Service volunteers want to be out there when he's talking about volunteer payments. He's since fixed that. On December 14, he goes to Hawaii, and his office doesn't put out a statement on that. He now concedes both the holiday and the statement are a mistake. On January 2nd, after giving a press conference in Sydney, he goes to Cobargo and has that awkward confrontation with a woman down there and walks away from her. And on January 8, on Kangaroo Island, he has that incident where he indicates that there'd been no loss of life when 2 people had died, and he says, well, I was just referring to firefighters. Well, there've been reports those 2 people were fighting fires and heading home when they perished. So just a series of gaffes, and the more they try to play catch-up, the more gaffes there are. Now, there's a very interesting phone conversation Michael McCormack created between Scott Morrison and some firefighters on the weekend. Let's have a listen to that.
Michael and I and Susan and everyone else to go and get done what needs to be done in the future. We're not going to get distracted by all the noise and the rubbish and the crap, just like you don't get distracted by the noise and the rubbish and the crap. You just focus on what you've got to do, and I give you my absolute commitment. That's what I and Michael and Susan are going to do. So thanks, guys. You're a credit to your country and your community.
Well, Tom, it has to be said, if the Prime Minister's not distracted by the noise and rubbish and crap, why is he talking about the noise and rubbish and crap? It's pretty clear to me that he is distracted by exactly that. Now, what's also happened is a bit of movement from Scott Morrison on the climate change issue and on future fire seasons. Let's have a listen to what he said in response to a question from me on January the 2nd. Will this be the norm? That's the question, really. Will this be the norm, this sort of fire season? Do you fear that as Prime Minister?
Well, this season has been quite extraordinary in terms of the very lengthy drought that has preceded it.
So that's what he said then about when I said, is this the new norm? Now let's see what he says in terms of that, in terms of fire seasons and what Defence will have to do going forward yesterday.
Well, I think we've got to prepare for a new normal. And the new normal, I think there is a community expectation now that there'd be a more direct ability for the Commonwealth, particularly through the Australian Defence Forces, to be able to take action.
Now, Scott Morrison can't just get up and say, I'm going to do more about climate change. What he's saying is our target stays the same, and what people around him are saying is, yeah, but we can go above the target. People are focused on the target, not the limits of your policy, and we often exceed the target. So that's a bit of a movement in rhetoric, but he would feel at the moment he can't change the target. And the big reason for that is, how good is Queensland? Queensland was so good for Scott Morrison, Tom, at the election, as we know, that he won 24 of 30 seats there. If you took Queensland out of Australia, the coalition would have 53 seats and Anthony Albanese's Labor would have 62. So you see that in Queensland, you have a lot of people who'd be sceptical about the effects of climate change, don't want their power prices up, and most importantly, want coal jobs preserved, want those coal exports preserved. Scott Morrison's very sensitive to this as he attempts to strike a balance. And we saw another example of that this morning when we saw what Pauline Hanson had to say about Scott Morrison's performance and on climate change. Let's have a listen to that.
If you're going to have a Royal Commission into it, throw bloody climate change out the window and let's look at the pure facts of why we have had the bushfires, how they were handled, what we can do better to stop it happening again. You know, lowering the emissions as they're dead set on doing, and if you're going to charge people more taxes, how on earth is that supposed to reduce the Earth's temperatures?
This is the issue, of course, for Scott Morrison. This is one side of his flank, including some in his party, Andrew Clennell, that say, don't make any more change. You had George Christensen and Barnaby Joyce out straight away after he gave that indication yesterday that he might be one for turning. But at what point does he need to say, look, Queensland's important, but I need to make some sort of announcement, I need to make some more recognition, even if it is, you know, given with a caveat of, look, we're not stopping coal exports and so on, but we do need to do more about this. Is there going to be a point where he's pushed into more action is the question.
He is, but the problem is when he has to please two audiences, he kind of looks like he's sitting on the fence, and that's what he looked like yesterday. He did that ABC interview where he sort of moved towards raising the emissions target, and then at a press conference he was kind of emphatic he wouldn't be doing that. So it's almost what Bill Shorten was accused of in the election campaign, saying something different to Queensland and Victoria. Now, it's my understanding there's a very big, and I mentioned this last week, a very big announcement in the wings in New South Wales, a bilateral deal on climate change between the Commonwealth and the state, which will involve the building of transmission lines and interconnectors to South Australia and Victoria in order that more renewable energy projects can be built. So at some stage we'll see that. But it's not just Barnaby and Christensen who are talking like this, or indeed Pauline Hanson in Queensland. It's Matt Canavan, the Resources Minister, as well, expressing scepticism about the effect of climate change. So he just can't afford to split not only his government but his cabinet. Hanson preferences are so critical to the next election. and he needs those preferences. So he just can't swing too far to the left, Scott Morrison.
Clearly his preference is announcements like the one you were talking about and similar to the ones about hydro, for example, and he calls that practical, pragmatic without hurting the economy. That's his priority. It'll be whether or not he can do that and nothing further about the target to satisfy others concerned about the impact. I just wanted to ask you as well, Andrew, whether or not there's a concern for Scott Morrison. The electorate didn't know him all that well, apart from, you know, the man that stopped the boats before he became Prime Minister. So there's this limited sort of rapport. Does that mean when you lose so much from your approval rating, that's more of a concern? He didn't have, you know, the sort of runs on the board that other leaders have had, a bit of a longer time in opposition, a longer time as Prime Minister before this trust might be gone?
Look, I just think you're so spot on with your analysis there, Tom. I mean, that is the problem. You know, you got John Howard, who's been there a few years. He gets, as he said in our interview the other week, a few bumps. He can get over them, you know. The question will be the next Newspoll and the one after that in terms of whether Morrison can get over this bump. Now, there's a view there in the government, obviously, that he can snap back that personal approval rating, but it's not a great position to come into Parliament with in early February. But this is the issue. I said this morning, Tom, and that is during the election campaign, there was a real feeling from Australians that Scott Morrison was on their side. The danger for him now is that people no longer think that he's on their side and that they think he's on his own side. And Morrison will know that over the next few weeks he's got to work doubly hard to get some of that approval back, to get some of that love back from Australians.
Yeah, well, like it or not, the political year off to an early and earnest year. Andrew Clennell, thank you. We'll talk again later.
Thanks, mate.